What did it do? Elder Vethani Suril asked, and the contempt in her voice was older than the chamber itself. The question hung in the vaulted air of the adjudication tier like a stone dropped into still water. 600 years of xenobiological tribunals had been convened in this room, species classified, threat ratings assigned, containment protocols approved or denied, and in all that time, Suril had never heard a question she could not answer before the witness finished speaking. She had sat on the Elder Council of the Pelori Intersystem Compact for 41 years. She had reviewed the biological dossier of over 300 sentient species. She had signed the containment orders for 11 of them, the quarantine mandates for 6, and the single extinction-level interdiction in the Compact's modern history. She understood threat. She cataloged it the way other people cataloged weather. The human sat in the testimony well below her. It was a female, mid-30s by their species developmental index, which was itself a data point that still unsettled Suril every time she reviewed it, because the human lifespan charts were so compressed that a mid-30s specimen had already lived nearly half its natural duration, yet showed no meaningful decline in any physical metric. The female wore a plain gray shipsuit with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she sat in the curved respondent's chair with her hands resting on the armrests and her feet flat on the floor and her spine straight and her face entirely, perfectly still. Suril had been watching that stillness for 11 minutes. It was the reason they were here. The witness senior field coordinator Draineth Yas of the Compact's Frontier Assessment Division stood at the testimony rail to Suril's left, his dorsal plates locked in the rigid configuration that his species used when delivering information they wished they did not have. He was Tessivar, broad, dense-boned, evolved on a high-gravity world with an atmospheric pressure that would crush most carbon-based respiratory systems. The Tessivar were not, as a species, easily frightened. Draineth Yas looked frightened. "It sat," he said. The chamber was silent. Suril waited. Around her, the 11 other members of the Elder Council, seated in the raised semicircular gallery that overlooked the testimony well, did not move. The acoustic dampening of the chamber was absolute. The only sound was the faint harmonic hum of the environmental regulators cycling air through vents that had been carved into the chamber's basalt walls when this facility was built, 4 centuries before any of them were born. "Elaborate," Suril said. Draineth Yas looked at the human in the testimony well. The human did not look back. She was looking at the wall across from her, a smooth expanse of polished dark stone, with an expression that Suril's cultural reference database could not classify. Not anger, not fear, not boredom, something between patience and absence, as if the woman had found a way to be present in the chair and elsewhere at the same time. "The incident occurred during a routine frontier survey," Yas said. "Assessment Team Cathara 12. Mixed crew 4 Tessivar field specialists, 2 Orvani sensor technicians and 1 human contractor. The human was a structural consultant. Her name is Marin Voss. She had been embedded with the team for 9 weeks. "The incident," Suril repeated. Yas's dorsal plates shifted. The team was conducting subsurface geological mapping in the Dreven Shelf region, deep crust work, seismic profiling, standard protocol. On the 43rd day of the survey, a subsurface pocket collapse triggered a cascading structural failure in the primary survey tunnel. The team was 1,100 meters below the surface when the tunnel system began to come apart. He paused. Suril noted the pause and the reason for it. Yas was not collecting his thoughts. He was controlling his biological stress responses well enough to continue speaking. She could see the fine tremor in his dorsal plates, the involuntary vibration that Tessivar physiology produced when stress hormones were present but consciously held in check. He was testifying about something that had happened to him, and his body had not forgotten. 4 team members were killed instantly by the initial collapse. The 2 Orvani and 2 of the Tessivar. Structural failure, crush injury, immediate. The remaining two Tessivar, myself and field specialist Koreth Denon, were trapped in a partially intact section of the primary bore approximately 400 meters from the collapse face. The human was with us. Injuries. Koreth had a compound fracture of his lower right limb and internal hemorrhaging from blunt force compression. I had lacerations and a fractured dorsal plate. The human was uninjured. Searle noted that, uninjured, in a tunnel collapse that killed 4 people and critically wounded 2 others. The incident report had attributed it to positioning. The human had been standing near the center of the intact bore section when the collapse propagated, while the others had been distributed along the tunnel walls where the structural failure was most severe. Luck, the report said, but Searle had read enough incident reports to recognize the difference between luck and awareness. The human had been standing in the safest part of the tunnel before the tunnel fell. She filed it and moved on. Emergency protocol. Standard. I activated the distress beacon. Signal confirmation returned within 90 seconds. The surface relay station acknowledged receipt and transmitted an estimated rescue timeline, which was 14 hours. The number settled into the chamber like sediment. Searle had read the incident report. She knew the number. She wanted the tribunal to hear it from the witness. 14 hours, she repeated for the record. And during those 14 hours, what happened? Yas looked at the human again. Maren Voss had not moved. Her hands were on the armrests. Her feet were on the floor. Her breathing was invisible. Searle could not detect the rise and fall of her chest from the gallery, even with the enhanced optical array built into her council station. The first thing she did, Yas said, was stop. The first vignette had been playing on the tribunal's evidence display for 6 minutes, when Elder Searle began to feel the first shift in her assessment. The display showed biosensor telemetry from the 3 survivors' monitoring implants, time synced to the audio recording from Yas's field unit. The data was clinical, clean, presented in the compact standard evidence format. 3 parallel timelines, one for each survivor, plotting heart rate, respiratory rate, cortisol levels, core temperature, and movement index against a common clock. The clock started at the moment of the collapse. In the first 60 seconds, all 3 timelines spiked. Heart rate surged. Cortisol flooded. Movement indices showed the frantic, uncoordinated bursts of biological panic, the body's deep evolutionary response to entrapment, to darkness, to the sound of stone grinding against stone above and below and on every side. Yas's heart rate hit 174. Koreth's hit 189, dangerously high for a Tessivar with internal injuries. The human's hit 131. Then the human's timeline changed. Over the next 4 minutes, while Yas and Koreth were still in the acute panic phase, still hyperventilating, still scrabbling at the rubble with their hands, the human's heart rate dropped. Steadily, smoothly, not the jagged, irregular descent of shock or loss of consciousness. A controlled decline, as if someone had taken hold of a dial inside her chest and turned it down, increment by increment, until the number settled at 58 beats per minute. 58 in a collapsed tunnel, 1,100 meters below the surface. With 4 dead colleagues behind a wall of rubble, and 2 critically injured survivors beside her, and 14 hours of dark ahead. Searle stared at the telemetry. She had reviewed thousands of stress response profiles across dozens of species. She had never seen a conscious organism reduce its own heart rate under acute threat conditions. The Orvani could enter torpor, but that was an autonomic shutdown, unconscious, involuntary, a biological circuit breaker. The Tessivar could suppress cortisol through meditative practice, but it took 20 minutes of deliberate effort and a quiet environment. The human had done this in 4 minutes in a cave-in, while her companions screamed. Coordinator Yas, Searle said, describe what the human did during those first 4 minutes. Not the telemetry, what you saw. Yas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, His voice had the flat quality of a man reciting something he had replayed in his memory many times and still could not explain. She stood up. She was on the ground when the collapse stopped. We were all on the ground, dust in the air, dark. The emergency lighting had failed, and the only illumination was the amber glow of the field unit's status display. I could hear Korath beside me. The sound he was making was not a sound I had heard from a Tessivar before, and the stone above us was still moving, settling, grinding, the kind of sound that tells you the structure is not finished failing. She stood up first. She did not speak. She did not look at the rubble behind us or the fractured ceiling above us. She stood in the center of the intact section, and she closed her eyes and she breathed. That is all. She breathed. 5 breaths, long, slow, through her nose. I could hear each breath distinctly over the sound of the settling stone, because they were that controlled, that measured. The same interval between each inhale and each exhale, as precise as a calibrated instrument. And then she opened her eyes, and she was different. Different how? Still, completely still, she looked at me. She looked at Korath. She assessed our injuries. I do not know how. She is not a physician, but she looked at us the way a physician looks at a scan readout. Calmly, systematically. Her eyes moved from my lacerations to Korath's fracture to the angle of the ceiling in a single sweep, the way you read a diagnostic display left to right, top to bottom, every data point registered. Then she sat down on the floor, cross-legged, and she said 4 words. Which were, 14 hours, we're fine. Suro looked at the human in the testimony well. Marin Voss's expression had not changed. Her pulse, displayed on the tribunal's real-time biometric overlay, read 61 beats per minute. She was sitting in front of 12 elder council members in a chamber that had issued extinction-level interdictions, and her heart rate was 61. The same heart rate she had maintained in a collapsed tunnel for 14 hours. Suro turned back to the evidence display and advanced the timeline. The second vignette began at hour 3. Korath Denon's internal hemorrhaging had worsened. The biosensor telemetry showed his blood pressure dropping in a pattern that Suro recognized, the slow, irreversible descent that preceded hypovolemic shock in Tessivar physiology. His heart rate was erratic. His cortisol had plateaued at a level that indicated his body's stress response had exhausted itself and was now simply failing to regulate. He was dying, slowly but measurably, and with 11 hours of rescue still ahead. On the audio recording, Yas could be heard attempting to stabilize Korath with the emergency medical kit, a field unit designed for surface injuries, not internal trauma. His breathing was ragged. His voice cracked between words. Twice he called Korath's name and received no response. The human's telemetry was a flat line, not dead, alive, profoundly alive, but so stable that the monitoring system had flagged it as a potential sensor malfunction. Heart rate 57, respiratory rate 8. Core temperature had dropped 0.6 degrees from her baseline, a controlled hypothermic adjustment that reduced her body's oxygen consumption and metabolic output. She was conserving resources, deliberately. The way a machine powers down non-essential systems during a low-energy state. Except she was not powered down. The movement index showed her active. She opened the structural assessment kit, Yas said, the one she had brought for the geological survey. She emptied it onto the floor and sorted the contents by function. She did not speak while she did this. She did not ask me what she should do. She organized the tools, cutting implements, adhesive compounds, flexible structural mesh, a portable illumination unit, and then she crawled to Korath and she examined him. She is not a physician, Suro said. No, she is a structural consultant. She builds things. She told me later, when I asked, that she had taken a 20-hour emergency medical course 6 years earlier, a requirement for frontier work, and that she remembered the section on internal bleeding because the instructor had used a metaphor she liked. He said internal hemorrhaging was a structural failure of the circulatory system, a pipe bursting inside a wall. She said she understood pipes. The chamber was silent. Cyril felt the attention of the 11 other council members like heat against her skin. They were all watching the same telemetry. They were all reading the same heart rate, 57 beats per minute, 8 breaths per minute, core temperature self-adjusted, and the woman was performing trauma assessment by analogy to plumbing. Walk the tribunal through what she did, Cyril said, specifically. She cut the flexible structural mesh into strips using a geological sample saw. The saw was designed for rock samples, hard mineral cores, basalt sections. She used it on the mesh with steady, even strokes, producing strips of uniform width. Then she positioned Korath on his back and palpated his abdomen. She explained to me what she was looking for: rigidity, distension, areas of localized heat. When she found what she believed was the hemorrhage site, she constructed a compression brace. From structural mesh and adhesive compound. She layered the strips in a crisscross pattern over his lower abdomen and applied the adhesive at each intersection. She tightened it incrementally over 40 minutes, monitoring his breathing and skin color as she worked. She told me later that she was watching for his gill plates to change shade. When they went from gray to blue-gray, she said, the pressure was right. Gill plates, Cyril said. Tessivar respiratory membranes. She had learned to read them during the 9 weeks she spent with our team. She said she paid attention to them, the way she pays attention to stress fractures in load-bearing walls. Subtle changes that indicate systemic pressure. Elder Tessia Moore leaned forward. She learned to read the vital signs of an alien species through observation alone, without medical training. In 9 weeks, Yas confirmed. When I asked her about it, she said it was not difficult. She said humans are, and these were her words, wired to read faces. She said she did not think about it consciously. She noticed the color changes in Korath's gill plates the same way she noticed changes in the color of concrete under thermal stress. Automatically. She said humans evolved as social predators, and that reading the physiological state of other organisms was a baseline capability, not a trained skill. Moore's computational overlay display, cycling through the human's telemetry data, had frozen mid-calculation. She stared at it without restarting it. And the compression brace, Cyril said, did it work? Korath lived. The rescue team's surgical assessment indicated that the compression had slowed the hemorrhage by approximately 60%. The lead surgeon told me that without the intervention, Korath would have entered terminal hypovolemic shock at approximately hour 7. She bought him 7 hours with a geological sample saw, structural mesh, and a metaphor about pipes. Cyril wrote nothing down. The tribunal's recording system captured everything. But she wanted to write it down. She wanted the physical act of pressing a stylus to a surface to help her understand what she was hearing, because the clinical part of her mind, the part that had classified 300 species, was encountering something it did not have a category for. The human's heart rate on the real-time overlay read 61, still 61. Cyril pulled the compact's neurobiological reference database onto her personal display and searched for documented cases of conscious heart rate suppression under acute threat. The search returned 412 entries. Every one involved pharmaceutical intervention, environmental modification, genetic augmentation, or unconscious torpor. Not one involved a baseline organism, unsupported, suppressing its own autonomic response through a voluntary breathing pattern. She narrowed the search to cases involving sustained suppression, 4 hours or longer. The database returned 7 entries. All were torpor species. All were unconscious during the suppression period. The human had been awake for 14 hours, talking, performing surgery, calculating atmospheric composition, counting another person's breaths. There was no precedent. In 600 years of the compact's biological research across over 300 species, there was no documented instance of what this human had done. Not an outlier, not a variant, Not even a theoretical model. The behavior she was looking at did not exist in the registry. Searle closed the database. She had the information she needed. What she did not have was a framework to put it in. The third vignette broke the room's composure. At hour 6, the tunnel had shifted. Searle advanced the evidence timeline and watched the seismic data spike. A secondary collapse event not as catastrophic as the first, but enough to redistribute the weight of the overburden and narrow the intact section by approximately 40%. The ceiling dropped. Rubble fell. The available air volume decreased measurably, and the atmospheric monitors showed CO2 levels beginning to climb toward the threshold that would trigger hypoxic distress in both Tessivar and human respiratory systems within 4 hours. Yas's telemetry spiked again. Heart rate 161, cortisol surge. The audio captured his breathing fast, shallow, the sound of a man whose body was flooding itself with every chemical alarm it possessed. Korath's telemetry barely registered the event. He was semi-conscious, maintained by the compression brace and whatever reserves his Tessivar physiology could still muster. The human's telemetry did not spike, it dipped. Heart rate from 57 to 53. Respiratory rate from 8 to 6. Core temperature dropped another 0.2 degrees. Her body's response to the secondary collapse, to the ceiling dropping, to the air shrinking, to the clock accelerating toward a deadline that might now arrive before rescue, was to slow down further. Elder Korath Vesh, the council's neurological assessment specialist, made a sound. Searle glanced at him. He was Orvani, small, precise, evolved for analytical processing, and his secondary hands were trembling against his armrests. He did not appear to notice. His primary eyes were locked on the telemetry display, tracking the human's heart rate as it settled at 53. "That is the wrong direction," he said quietly. It was. Every biological model in the Compact's database predicted the same response to a worsening threat: escalation. Heart rate up, cortisol up, respiration up. The body preparing to fight or flee, or in the absence of either option, to burn itself out in an unsustainable blaze of chemical panic until the threat resolved or the organism failed. That was the universal pattern. 300 species in the registry, not one exception. Until now. Searle played the audio. She had read the transcript. She wanted the council to hear the voice. There was a sound of rubble settling, dust, Yas's breathing, ragged and loud, and then beneath it, so quiet the audio system had to amplify it to be audible, the human's voice. "We're fine." 2 words, the same tone she might have used to confirm a cargo manifest or acknowledge a routine systems check. Flat, calm, not reassuring. Reassurance implies awareness that the listener is afraid and an effort to address that fear. This was not that. This was a statement of fact delivered by a person for whom the fact was self-evident. "We're fine." The air was running out. The ceiling had dropped half a meter. 8 hours of rescue remained. And the human said, "We're fine the way a person says the sun is up." "Coordinator Yas," Searle said, "what happened between hour 6 and hour 14? Yas did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed. The official cadence was gone. What remained was the voice of a man describing something he had lived through and still could not process. "She managed us." "Explain." "She managed us the way I do not have a precise comparison. The way a systems controller manages a failing reactor, methodically, without urgency. She monitored our oxygen consumption. She calculated the rate of CO2 buildup and determined that we needed to reduce our metabolic output by 30% to survive until rescue. She told me to lie down. She told me to breathe slowly. She counted my breaths for me. She said, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She repeated it until I matched her rhythm. It took me 40 minutes to bring my heart rate below 90. And during those 40 minutes, hers was 53. It never changed. She sat beside me on the floor with her legs crossed and her back against the wall, and she counted breaths for me as calmly as if she were counting cargo crates being loaded onto a freighter. She held her datapad between her knees and tracked the atmospheric composition readings every few minutes, adjusting our target respiratory rate based on the CO2 curve. She never raised her voice. She never lost count. She was running calculations and counting my breaths and monitoring CoreF's compression brace simultaneously, and none of it appeared to require effort. Had she performed this kind of stress management before, on another person? I asked her that. Later, she said she had talked her younger brother through a panic attack once when he was 12, on Earth, during a storm. That was her reference experience. A younger brother, during a storm. Cyril let that settle. A woman who had learned to regulate another person's autonomic nervous system by comforting a frightened child during bad weather was now applying the same principle to keep a critically stressed alien alive in a collapsed subterranean shaft 1,100 meters underground. The skill had scaled. From a bedroom to a cave-in, from a child to a Tessavar field specialist, from weather to geological catastrophe, and the human had not needed to adjust, retrain, or prepare. She had done it the way she breathed automatically because the underlying architecture was the same. The fourth vignette arrived like a change in atmospheric pressure quiet, but every sensor in the room registered it. At hour 9, with CO2 levels climbing and Yas's cognitive function beginning to fog at the edges, Marin Voss had started a conversation about subsurface density gradients. The audio played through the chamber's reproduction system with clinical fidelity, background hum of settling stone, the faint wet sound of Korath's compromised breathing, and the human's voice, low and even. Tell me about the survey, the readings from the Western Shelf, the subsurface density anomalies you flagged at Site 9. Yas's voice thick and unsteady. What? The density anomalies. You thought they might indicate a mineral pocket. Walk me through the data. A long pause. Why? Because you need something to think about that isn't this room, and because I'm curious about the readings. The gradient pattern looked unusual. And then in the audio, Yas began to talk about subsurface density gradients. Haltingly at first, his words slurred and uncertain, then with increasing focus as the familiar territory of his professional expertise pulled him back from the edge of cognitive failure. The human asked questions, specific, technical, engaged questions about geological methodology that demonstrated she had been paying attention to his work for 9 weeks. She drew him into a conversation about mineral composition and seismic reflection coefficients and the specific anomalies at Survey Site 9, and she held him there in that conversation for 2 hours. She asked about the calibration of his deep scan array. She asked about the discrepancy between the initial readings and the confirmation pass. She asked whether the density anomaly at Site 9 was consistent with natural mineral deposition, or whether it might indicate a buried structure from a prior geological epoch. Each question was more specific than the last, and each one required Yas to access a deeper layer of his professional knowledge that lived in the part of his brain that was still working, the part that was not drowning in cortisol and CO2, and the sound of stone settling above him. His heart rate during those 2 hours dropped from 88 to 71. Hers held at 53. Cyril stopped the audio. The tribunal chamber was very quiet. She was managing his stress response, Elder Vesh said. His voice was barely audible. Through conversation, she identified that his cortisol levels were unsustainable, and she intervened using cognitive redirection. She gave him a mental task, something familiar and structured and safe to think about. She was performing psychological triage. She is not a psychologist, Cyril said. No, Yas said from the testimony rail. She is a structural consultant. When I asked her after, when we were out, why she had asked about the density readings, she said, You were going to panic yourself into cardiac arrest. I needed you to think about something else. The survey data was the only thing in that tunnel I could give you that was yours. The only thing in that tunnel I could give you that was yours. Cyril sat with that sentence. It sat in her like something she had swallowed, a weight that settled below her ribs and would not move. She looked at the council. Dreven Saul, the military assessment specialist, had closed his tactical overlay display. He was not looking at data anymore. He was looking at the human with an expression that carried 300 years of professional experience and a single, clear conclusion. This species does something we cannot do. There is one additional detail from the period between hours 9 and 12, Yas said. He had not been asked to continue, but the testimony rail's protocol light was still active, and his dorsal plates had shifted into a configuration. Cyril recognized the posture of a Tessivar who needed to say something before the opportunity passed. The water. Cyril nodded for him to proceed. We had 2 liters of emergency water in the field kit. Standard allocation for a 3-person team on a 6-hour subsurface excursion. It was not designed for a 14-hour entrapment. She calculated consumption requirements based on body mass, ambient temperature, and metabolic output. She divided the supply into 9 portions, 3 for each of us, timed to specific hours. She did the math in her head. She told me the numbers and I checked them against my field calculator. Were they accurate? Correct to 2 decimal places. She accounted for the temperature differential between Tessivar and human thermoregulation, adjusted for Korath's reduced metabolic output due to his injuries, and factored in the declining atmospheric quality. She told me that Korath's portion should be administered at hours 4, 8, and 12, mine at hours 3, 7, and 11, and hers at hours 5, 9, and 13. She scheduled her own portions last, Elder Vesh observed. Yas was quiet for a moment. I noticed that too. When I pointed it out, she said it was not altruism. She said that her body was consuming fewer resources due to her lower metabolic rate and that she could tolerate a longer interval between hydrations. She said, I'm running cooler than both of you. The math works. And did it work? We had approximately 200 milliliters remaining when the rescue team arrived. She had calculated a surplus of 250. The margin of error across 14 hours of resource management, done entirely in her head, in a collapsing tunnel with declining oxygen, was 50 milliliters. 50 milliliters across 14 hours. Cyril looked at the human in the testimony well. Marin Voss had shifted her weight slightly, the first voluntary movement Cyril had observed since the proceedings began. She had moved one hand from the armrest to her knee. The motion was economical, purposeful, and utterly without urgency, as though even her fidgeting was subject to the same metabolic discipline as everything else. The 6th vignette was the shortest and the worst. Hour 12, 2 hours before rescue. The CO2 levels had crossed the threshold that triggered hypoxic impairment in Tessivar respiratory systems. Yas's cognitive function was degrading. His speech on the audio recording was slurred. His telemetry showed intermittent arrhythmia, his heart skipping beats as his blood oxygen dropped below the levels his body could sustain. The human's blood oxygen was 91%, low, functionally dangerous for most species. Her heart rate was 51. She had slowed herself further, deliberately. She had been reducing her metabolic rate for 12 hours, not by sleeping, not by entering any form of unconsciousness, but by a sustained act of physiological self-regulation that Cyril could not explain, and that the Compact's entire neurobiological research division, consulted after the incident, could not explain either. The human body under acute threat releases adrenaline, cortisol, and a cascade of stress hormones designed to prepare the organism for fight or flight. Every species in the Compact's registry responded to entrapment with some version of this response. The amplitude varied, the neurochemistry varied, but the direction was always the same: faster, hotter, louder, more. The human had gone the other way: slower, cooler, quieter, less. Not because her stress response was absent. The telemetry showed cortisol present in her bloodstream at levels that would have incapacitated an Orvani, but because she had overridden it. She had taken the body's own emergency chemical flood and refused to obey it. Her conscious mind had looked at the adrenaline and the cortisol and the racing heart and the screaming lungs and had said, "No, I decide. I decide how fast my heart beats. I decide how slowly I breathe. I decide when to be afraid, and I have decided that now is not the time." At hour 12, with Yas fading and Korath unconscious and the air poisoning them by degrees, she had found one more gear. She reduced her respiratory rate to 5 breaths per minute. She reduced her heart rate to 51. She placed one hand on Yas's chest and matched his breathing to hers physically, through the pressure of her palm, slowing his rhythm by slowing her own until his impaired body followed the pace she set. The audio captured it. For 20 minutes, the only sound in that tunnel was breathing. Hers leading, his following, slow, measured, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds hold, 5 seconds out, 5 seconds hold. The sound of one organism pulling another back from the edge through nothing more than the disciplined control of her own lungs. Then her voice barely above a whisper: "Stay with me, draineth, match me in, hold, out, hold." His breathing steadied. Not much. Enough. His arrhythmia resolved. His blood oxygen stabilized at 84%, low but survivable. He would lose consciousness 14 minutes later, but gently, his body settling into rest rather than crashing into failure, because she had caught him. Because she had pressed her hand against an alien chest and imposed her own rhythm on a body that was not hers, and it had worked. Because the principle was universal even if the physiology was not. Slow breathing calms a frightened animal, and all living things are, underneath the intelligence and the language and the civilization, frightened animals. Yas lived, Korath lived. The rescue team breached the tunnel at hour 14, and found the 3 of them exactly as described. Korath unconscious under the improvised compression brace, Yas unconscious with the human's hand still on his chest, and Marin Voss sitting, cross-legged on the floor of a collapsed tunnel 1,100 meters underground with a heart rate of 49 beats per minute, and an expression that the rescue team leader described in her field report as resting. Resting in a grave. The rescue team leader, a Tessavar emergency extraction specialist with 18 years of field experience, had included a supplemental observation in her report. Surel pulled it up on the evidence display and read it aloud for the council. Supplemental observation: extraction lead Korvath. Subject Voss was alert, oriented, and responsive upon contact. She provided a clear, organized briefing on the status of both injured personnel, including Specialist Korath's estimated blood loss, the time of his last conscious response, and the structural integrity of the compression brace she had constructed. She recommended a specific extraction angle for Korath's stretcher based on the position of his fracture relative to the brace. The briefing lasted approximately 90 seconds. She then stood, unassisted, and walked to the extraction point under her own power. She did not require medical evaluation. She requested water. 90 seconds. After 14 hours underground, the human had delivered a structured medical briefing in 90 seconds. Not rambling, not confused, not emotionally compromised, organized, prioritized, the injured first, the structural details second, her own needs last. A glass of water. Surel called a recess. She did not explain why. She did not need to. The 11 other council members rose from their gallery seats and filed into the deliberation chamber behind the tribunal hall with the rigid, mechanical movements of people whose bodies were performing routine tasks, while their minds processed something that did not fit into their existing framework for understanding the universe. The recess lasted 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, Cyril stood at the window of the deliberation chamber and looked out over the capital's skyline, the spired administrative towers of the compact's central district, the gentle arc of the atmospheric processors along the horizon, the steady pulse of transit vehicles in their lanes, and tried to name what she was feeling. It was not contempt. That had been her starting position, the default register she brought to every new species assessment, because contempt was safe. Contempt meant the subject was beneath the threshold. Contempt meant the system worked, the classifications held, the world was ordered. She had walked into this tribunal expecting to feel contempt for another soft-tissue, deathworld biped with no natural defenses, and a lifespan that barely cleared a century. What she felt now was not contempt. She had classified 300 species. She had signed 11 containment orders. She understood threat in all its biological dimensions: speed, strength, toxicity, reproductive capacity, environmental adaptability, intelligence, tool use, social coordination. She had a taxonomy for danger. Every species she had ever assessed fit inside that taxonomy somewhere: the fast ones, the strong ones, the toxic ones, the clever ones. They all had a category. They all had a rating. They all made sense. The human did not make sense. Not because of what it could do to the world around it. Cyril had seen species that were faster, stronger, more toxic, more numerous. The Cassara parasites could consume a biosphere. The Vedrani warforms could survive hard vacuum. The Tessivar themselves could withstand pressures and impacts that would liquefy most organic tissue. The human's threat was not external, it was internal. The human could control itself. Not in the way that the Orvani entered torpor and involuntary shutdown, a biological circuit breaker, the body protecting itself by turning off. Not in the way the Tessivar could meditate, a trained skill, requiring conditions, requiring time, requiring the absence of active threat. The human could sit in a collapsing tunnel with poison air and dying companions and simply decide what her body was going to do. Heart rate chosen. Respiratory rate chosen, cortisol response overridden, pain acknowledged and set aside, fear present and refused. The body screams run, the human says no. And it holds. For 14 hours it holds, not through glands or instinct or evolutionary shutdown, through will, through a decision made by a conscious mind that is, in some way Cyril could not define and the compact's neurobiologists could not explain, sovereign over its own flesh. That was the trait. That was the thing the tribunal had been convened to assess, not the structural engineering, not the improvised medical intervention, not the cognitive redirection or the water rationing or the mental arithmetic. Those were applications. The trait underneath them, the one that made all of them possible, was the sovereignty. A human could decide not to panic, not eventually, not after training, not after drugs or meditation or environmental support. Now, immediately, in the moment the ceiling falls, a human could take the animal brain's million-year-old survival alarm, the one that every species in the galaxy obeyed because it was older than consciousness, older than thought, older than choice, and overrule it. And the thing that frightened Cyril, the thing that had driven her to call a recess, because she needed 40 minutes to stand at a window and stare at the sky and let the feeling settle into a shape she could hold, was that the human did not appear to think this was remarkable. Maren Voss had sat through 3 hours of testimony about her own biological response profile with the same flat, patient stillness she had maintained in the tunnel. Her heart rate had not changed. Her expression had not changed. She was not proud. She was not performing. She was not aware, in any way that Cyril could detect, that what she had done was extraordinary. Because it wasn't, not to her, not to a human. This was what they were. Behind her, she heard the other council members in their own recesses of silence. Tessia Moore had pulled up the telemetry data on her personal display and was running the same analysis Cyril had run earlier, searching the compact's biological database for precedent. Cyril did not need to ask what she was finding. The look on Moore's face said it clearly. Nothing. There was nothing. Dreven Saul stood at the far end of the deliberation chamber with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the floor. He had not spoken since the testimony about children learning the breathing technique faster than adults. Koreth Vesh had taken a seat at the deliberation table and was writing something on his personal record pad slowly, carefully. The way a person writes when they know the words they are putting down will matter for a long time. Cyril walked to him. She looked over his shoulder. He had written a single line. Recommend immediate consultation with the Compact's Strategic Threat Assessment Board. Classification framework requires a new category. He looked up at her. His primary eyes were steady, but his secondary hands were still locked rigid, the trembling controlled through conscious effort. And Orvani managing his own stress response through will. It was, Cyril realized, the closest any species in this room could come to what the human did naturally. And it was costing Vesh visible effort to maintain for 40 minutes. The human had done it for 14 hours. Cyril returned to the tribunal chamber and called the council to order. The gallery seats filled. The evidence display reactivated. The acoustic dampening settled into its familiar hum. Marin Voss sat in the testimony well, 61 beats per minute. Ms. Voss, Cyril said. It was the first time she had addressed the human directly. She had spent the first 3 hours listening to Yas's testimony, studying the telemetry, reviewing the evidence from behind the safe distance of data and expert witness and third-person narration. She did not want to be at a safe distance anymore. She wanted to ask the question directly. Yes, Voss said. Her voice was clear, mid-register, unhurried. She looked up at the gallery with steady brown eyes that did not scan the room or dart between faces. She picked Cyril and held. During the 14 hours you spent trapped in the tunnel, your heart rate never exceeded 58 beats per minute after the initial 4-minute adjustment period. Your respiratory rate stabilized at 8 and declined to 5. Your cortisol levels were present but functionally suppressed. Your core temperature self-regulated downward by 0.8 degrees over the duration of the event. Cyril paused. How? Voss considered the question. Not for long. She was not stalling or formulating. She was deciding how much to explain. Breathing, she said. Breathing. Controlled breathing. Box breathing, we call it. In for a count, hold for a count, out for a count, hold for a count. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system, slows the heart, reduces cortisol, calms the body down. It's a technique. A technique, Cyril repeated. A technique you learned. Standard training. I took a wilderness survival course before my first frontier contract. 8 days. They taught us box breathing on day 1. Day 1 of an 8-day course. The foundational skill that had allowed this woman to override her own stress response, reduce her heart rate by 60%, manage her body temperature, calculate water rations in her head, perform emergency surgery by analogy, and keep 2 alien colleagues alive for 14 hours in a collapsing tunnel taught on day 1. As a baseline. As the thing you learn first before the other things, because it is so fundamental to the human approach to survival that it does not even register as special. And the metabolic reduction, Cyril said, the core temperature adjustment, the reduction of oxygen consumption. Side effects. If you breathe slowly enough for long enough, your body adjusts. Metabolism drops, temperature drops, you burn less oxygen. It's not a special ability. It's just physiology. Any human can do it. Any human. Cyril heard the words and understood them, and felt them land in the center of her chest, with a weight that had nothing to do with the physics of sound transmission. Any human. Not trained operators, not special units, not genetic outliers or augmented specimens or the product of centuries of selective breeding. Any human. All of them. 8 billion baseline organisms on a single death world, every one of them carrying the neural architecture to override their own survival instincts through a breathing exercise taught on day one of an 8-day course. The psychological intervention, Searle said. The conversation about the geological survey data. You used it to manage Coordinator Yas's stress response. I used it to keep him from hyperventilating himself into cardiac arrest, Voss said. He was going to die if he kept breathing that fast. I needed him to slow down. Giving him something to think about was the fastest way to do that. Where did you learn that? Voss looked at her, the steady brown eyes, the flat, patient stillness. My mother used to do it when I was a child, she said. When I was scared, she would ask me questions about school, about what I was learning, something I could answer, something I knew. It gave me somewhere to put my attention that wasn't the fear. She paused. It works on everyone. It's not a medical technique. It's parenting. Parenting. The technique that had saved Draenith Yas's life, the cognitive redirection, the strategic deployment of familiar information to override a lethal stress response, was not military training. It was not emergency medical protocol. It was not a classified countermeasure developed by human intelligence agencies. It was something a mother did for a frightened child. Elder Dreven Saul broke his silence for the first time since the proceedings had begun. His voice was careful, measured the voice of a man who had commanded fleets and evaluated species-level threats for 3 centuries, and who was choosing his words as though each one carried structural weight. Ms. Voss, you said any human can do this. The breathing technique, the metabolic reduction, the cognitive redirection. Yes, including children. Voss looked at him. Children learn it fastest, actually. They're more adaptable, less resistance to the idea that you can control your own body. Adults overthink it. Saul turned to Searle. He did not speak. His expression said everything his voice did not, and what it said was, "We are not prepared for this." Searle nodded once and turned back to the human. Ms. Voss, I want to return to the secondary collapse at hour 6. The ceiling dropped. The air volume decreased by 40%. Your 2 companions, one critically wounded, one in acute distress, were completely dependent on you for survival. In that moment, according to the telemetry, your heart rate decreased. Yes. Not increased. Decreased. Yes. From 57 to 53. That sounds right. Why? Voss was quiet for 3 seconds. Searle counted them. Because the situation got worse, Voss said. And when things get worse, you need to be calmer, not less calm. You need more control, not less. If the room shrinks, you breathe slower. If the clock shortens, you think clearer. That's the principle. Stress is information. It tells you the environment has changed. It doesn't tell you to panic. Panic is a choice, and it's always the wrong one. Panic is a choice. Searle heard the sentence and felt it rearrange something fundamental in her understanding of biology. Every species in the Compact's registry treated panic as an inevitability, an autonomic response as involuntary as a heartbeat or a pupil dilation. You could train for it. You could delay it. You could build systems and protocols and pharmaceutical interventions to mitigate its effects. But you could not choose not to have it. It happened to you, the way weather happened to a landscape. The human was saying it was optional. You described this as a principle, Searle said. Not a skill, a principle. It's how humans have survived, Voss said. For a very long time, before we had tools or medicine or shelter, we survived because we could sit still in a dangerous place and think clearly about what to do next, while the predator was circling, while the storm was overhead, while the river was rising. We sat still and we thought, and that's why we're still here. She said it without pride, without weight, as though she were explaining why water flows downhill. Ms. Voss, Searle said, are you afraid now in this tribunal? Voss considered the question with the same brief, honest assessment she had given every other. No, she said. Why not? Because nothing here is going to fall on me. The sentence landed in the chamber and stayed there. 12 elder council members, 400 years of institutional authority, the power to classify, contain, quarantine, or interdict an entire species, and the human was not afraid because the ceiling was stable. That was her threshold, not power, not authority. Not the political machinery of the largest interstellar governing body in the known galaxy. Physics. Would the structure hold? That was the only question the human's threat assessment system asked, and in this room the answer was yes, so the fear was absent. Cyril understood then, not intellectually, not as a data point in a species profile, but in her body, in the part of her that was older than language, what the human was. The human was not a weapon. It was not a predator. It was not a berserker or a war machine or any of the crude, comfortable categories the compact used for species that killed well. The human was something worse. The human was an organism that had mastered its own fear. That could sit in the dark and the dust and the shrinking air and the sound of stone grinding and choose to be still. That could take the most powerful force in biology, the survival imperative, the scream in the blood that said run or fight or die, and set it aside like an unnecessary tool. Not suppress it, not medicate it, not evolve past it. The fear was there. Marin Voss's cortisol levels confirmed that. The fear was present in her blood, in her muscles, in every cell of her body. It was screaming, and she had simply decided not to listen. I have one more question, Cyril said. Voss waited. The rescue team's report states that when they breached the tunnel, you were conscious, sitting upright, with your hand on coordinator Yas's chest. Your heart rate was 49. You had been underground for 14 hours. The rescue team leader described your expression as resting. She asked if you were all right. According to the report, you said, "We're fine. How's the weather up top?" Voss nodded. Sounds right. How's the weather up top? I wanted to know if the surface conditions had changed. We'd been expecting a pressure front from the west. If it had come through, the rescue route through the upper shafts might have been affected, and I wanted to know if they'd had trouble getting to us. You had been buried alive for 14 hours, and your first question was about the weather. Voss looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time in the proceedings, fully recognizable. It was mild confusion. The slight crease between the eyebrows that the cultural database classified as a human's response to being asked to explain something they considered self-evident. The tunnel was handled, she said. I was already thinking about what came next. The tunnel was handled. Cyril looked at the 11 other members of the Elder Council. She did not need to poll them. She could see it in their faces, in the way their bodies had shifted over the past 4 hours from professional attention to something closer to biological alarm. Tessia Moore's computational overlay had frozen mid-scroll, her primary hand suspended above the interface as though she had forgotten what she was reaching for. Korath Vesh's secondary hands had stopped trembling and gone rigid, locked against the armrests of his chair in a grip that whitened his joints. Dreven Saul was staring at the human with an expression Cyril had never seen him wear in 41 years of shared tribunal service. It was the expression of a man who had just realized that his entire threat classification system was missing a category. Not a category for the fast, or the strong, or the toxic. A category for the still. For the species that could sit in the fire and choose its own pulse, for the organism that treated fear itself, the universal biological constant, the one thing every living creature in the galaxy shared, the one response that connected the simplest microbe to the most complex civilization as optional. As a choice, one it could refuse. Cyril cleared her throat. The acoustic dampening caught the sound and held it close. This tribunal is prepared to issue its preliminary assessment, she said. The human species displays a unique neurological capability not previously documented in any sentient species in the compact's biological registry. Specifically, the demonstrated capacity for voluntary, sustained, conscious override of the autonomic stress response under acute life-threatening conditions, without external pharmaceutical, genetic, or technological intervention. This capability extends to metabolic self-regulation, core temperature adjustment, respiratory rate control, and the voluntary induction of parasympathetic nervous system dominance under conditions of extreme duress. Additionally, the subject demonstrated the ability to extend this physiological regulation to other organisms through direct physical contact and cognitive redirection techniques, effectively imposing her autonomic state on individuals of a different species. She paused. She looked at the testimony well, where Maren Voss sat with her hands on the armrests and her feet on the floor and her heart rate at 61, and she said the words the framework did not have a place for. Provisional recommendation. The human species is to be reclassified from Category 3, General Sapient, Standard Protocols, to Category 7, Advanced Adaptive, Enhanced Monitoring. The reclassification is provisional pending a full neurobiological study of the mechanism described in today's testimony. The study is to be conducted at the highest available security clearance. All field teams operating with embedded human personnel are to be briefed on the reclassification within one standard rotation. She looked at Maren Voss. Ms. Voss, you will be informed of the reclassification through your species diplomatic liaison. You are free to leave. Voss nodded. She stood from the testimony well, a single smooth motion, no stiffness, no hesitation, as though she had been sitting comfortably rather than occupying a chair designed for species under formal investigation. She smoothed the front of her shipsuit with one hand, the absent, automatic gesture of a person straightening their clothes, and she walked toward the chamber's exit. She stopped at the door. She turned. Elder Suro. Suro looked at her. The breathing technique I mentioned, box breathing. If Coordinator Yas is still experiencing stress symptoms from the incident, I'd be happy to teach it to him. It usually takes about 10 minutes to learn. 10 minutes. Maren Voss walked out of the tribunal chamber, and the door closed behind her, and Elder Vethani Surel sat in her council seat and stared at the empty testimony well and understood, with a clarity that settled into her the way stone settles into bedrock, that the breathing exercise she had just heard described the technique that allowed a human to override the most fundamental biological imperative in the known universe. To sit in a collapsing tunnel and choose her own heartbeat, and impose that choice on the bodies of other species, through nothing more than the pressure of her palm and the rhythm of her breath, could be taught. To anyone. In 10 minutes. She looked at the real-time biometric overlay, still tracking the human's monitoring implant as it moved through the corridor outside the chamber. The heart rate readout was steady, 59 beats per minute, walking pace. The woman was walking at a normal pace through the corridor of a facility that had just reclassified her entire species, and her heart was beating 59 times a minute. Surel's own heart rate, had anyone thought to check, was 97. The 12 seats of the Elder Council were full, and no one spoke, and no one moved, and the silence in the chamber was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard.